Welcome to Influenced, a book lovers podcast hosted by book besties Tegan and Amanda.
Here at Influenced, we cover books we've been influenced to read, thanks to the internet, as well as books that have influenced us.
This podcast will talk about books ranging in age demographics, including adult content. Plus, we've been known to swear a time or two, so keep that in mind in case you have others around you. With that said, we are happy you're here.
We were influenced to read Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus, which was released in 2022 by Doubleday. Its audiobook is 11 hours and 55 minutes at normal speed. And Bonnie was inspired to write this book based on some of her own life experiences. She used to be a creative director at an advertising agency, and a male coworker stole credit for her work. She also likes to row, so she has that in common with the main character. And, fun fact, Bonnie has a dog with a name that is also a number. In this book, there's a dog named 630, and Bonnie has a real-life dog named 99. And the main character, Elizabeth Sott, was written sort of as Bonnie's ideal role model.
I would love to ask Bonnie what 99 means.
It's actually kind of a sad story and ties in. Yeah, it's kind of a sad story. So Bonnie's best friend was killed in a car accident on her way to go visit Bonnie. And they had these nicknames for each other that were based on an old TV show. Like Bonnie was called 86 and her friend was called 99. And so after her friend died, she named her dog 99 after her nickname for her best friend.
Oh, that's really sad. That's a much sadder reason than the dog 630 in this book. But it's a very cute tribute.
I know.
Oh man, now I'm like, why did I ask?
No, that's a bummer.
Oh man, we're starting this off on a very sad note now.
Let's
turn it around.
We'll get more positive as we go.
Let's turn it around by saying that this book has been adapted to TV and is a show on Apple's TV Plus. And it features the one and only Brie Larson, who is well known for her role as Captain Marvel in the Marvel franchise. I have watched, I believe, 4 or 5 episodes of the TV series, and it's pretty good. I would say if you liked the book, I think you'll like the TV show. However, know that there are some decently significant differences between the book and the TV show. Like, the overarching premise is all the same, but there are some decent plot points that are changed. And I'm not saying it's wrong that they changed them, because adapting something for a TV show versus what is in a book are two completely different things. So I think they took the right liberties with it based on what I've watched so far. But I think it's good to know going into that if you do want to watch it.
Yeah, it's definitely good for people to know what they're getting into with that. I've only watched the first episode, and it's very different. There are a lot of changes.
I will say that first episode is probably the most drastically different than the whole book.
That's good to know. I mean, I'm still going to watch the entire TV series, and I'm going to eat it up because I love Brie Larson.
My poor husband, I kept being that person that as we've watched this show, I've been like, that wasn't in the book. In reality, it was this.
And something else that caught me by surprise with the first episode that I watched was the order that things are introduced, or the order that the story is told, is a little bit different as well.
So another fun fact is the cover art. The American cover art is the kind of orangish pinkish cover with a kind of colorful silhouette of Elizabeth with the pencil in her hair and the title, whereas the UK version is very different. And Bonnie has actually said that she does not love the American cover art because it doesn't necessarily lend to the story. And I wholeheartedly agree, because I did not know what to expect going into this book. I thought it was one genre and found out it was a whole other genre just looking at the cover and not reading the synopsis.
I'd agree with you on that. I didn't necessarily think it was a rom-com, but I think if I had picked up the UK version of this, I might have gone into the story expecting it to be different than what the American cover art led me to think. Like, I thought it was going to be kind of lighthearted. I thought it was going to be about like an attractive female main character, and it's a little heavy.
Yes, I 1,000% agree. And I believe, if I remember right, I don't have my copy on me, but the cover of the American version says something like a quote saying "laugh out loud" on it, insinuating that this is going to be some really funny moments. And don't get me wrong, there are some light moments in it, but I wouldn't say that's the majority of it. If you haven't read Lessons in Chemistry yet, don't worry. We're going to start with a spoiler-free overview, and then we will give you a fair warning before we get into too much detail with our discussions.
Touching a little bit on what Amanda said about the cover art, this is not a rom-com. I've heard a lot of people say they thought this book was a rom-com. It's actually historical fiction. Elizabeth Zott is the main character. She is a female chemist in the early 1960s, working with an all-male chemistry team at Hastings Institute. She's discredited because she's a woman and because she doesn't have her PhD. Both things totally outside of her control. Furthermore, her colleagues, both male and female alike, treat her like she's a secretary. She faces sexual discrimination, demeaning comments, you name it. And after a beaker stealing incident, she meets and falls for the Nobel Prize nominated chemist Kelvin Evans. But after life hits hard, Elizabeth finds herself doing what she must to take care of her daughter, Mad, aka Madeline. She agrees to go on a cooking show called Supper at 6, highlighting the science, the chemistry that is involved in cooking. She believes that all women are smart enough to understand the science and that there's no such thing as the average housewife. Through her show and through the people in her life, Elizabeth helps others find their true potential. This book is told from third-person point of view with multiple perspectives, including the dog, 630.
Thank you, Tegan. That was beautifully done. Now it's our time to give our star ratings of Lessons in Chemistry. So you might be wondering, how do we rate our reads? And Tegan and I have a very similar star format with 5 stars. So if it is a 5-star book, it's perfect. 4, nearly perfect. 3, it's a good book. 2, it's a bad book. And 1, you'll probably never hear on here because we likely DNF'd it. So Tegan, let's start it off. What did you give the book?
I rated this book 3.5 stars. I don't know that there's a lot of articulation in why I rated it 3.5 stars, mostly just the vibes. I did enjoy this book overall. I thought it was good for the most part. There were just some things in it that I thought were kind of weird. Like, it jumped perspectives or points of view abruptly, and I found myself feeling a little off track every time that happened, especially when it was the perspective of 630. I think having a talking dog is something that can work in movies or TV if it's done correctly. But in a book, it didn't hit right for me.
I will concur with everything that you said. I did give it 4 out of 5. I also found the multiple POVs to be a little irritating at times, and maybe that's too strong of a word, but yeah, a little disjointed or a little jarring, I guess might be the better way to say that. And typically when I read different POV books that I enjoy, they're pretty distinct where they break off and a new one starts, whether that's a mid-chapter break, a new chapter, or whatever. But this one I felt like almost had a lot of intermixed POVs throughout the chapter, almost giving it an omniscient point of view without it actually being an omniscient perspective. So that just felt a little disjointed for me. I agree with the 630 comment. I thought maybe it'd be like one little segment here, which I'm not going to talk about because that's a spoiler. and that justified the storytelling for there. But then it continued on, and I was like, I don't love this. And finally, I don't want to say it here, but there's another reason why I gave it a 4-star that I think the TV show is actually addressing.
Okay, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that since I'm only one episode in.
If you liked Lessons in Chemistry, we have a few reading recommendations that you might also like, including Her Hidden Genius by Marie Benedict, Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman, The Invisible Life of Eurydice Gusmao by Martha Batalla, and The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood.
And this is the part of our journey together where we'll do more of a deep dive into the story. So this is your spoiler warning. If you have not read Lessons in Chemistry, now's your time to stop listening if you don't want the ending to be spoiled. But if you don't mind spoilers, then by all means, join us further.
We're going to kick it off with our favorite exercise that we always start off our discussion section with, and that is our characters in 3 words. And for this one, we are keeping it simple and easy, and we are just going to cover Elizabeth in our 3 words. Mine being logical, ambitious, and influential.
Oh, I like influential. That's a really good word for her. The 3 words I picked are intelligent, assertive, and nonconformist.
Yeah, she definitely didn't conform to anything, that's for sure. Yeah, and that's why we love her.
What was your initial expectation of the book? Like, where did you think it was going when you started reading it?
Well, we've touched on this a little bit, and I initially thought this book was a rom-com. Just by looking at the cover and seeing other people cover this book, but do it in a way that's just like a yes or no, or like I liked this and move on to another book, and they're doing like quick reviews. So I just thought it was a rom-com because the artwork and the design of it just lend itself to being that way. And then I read the synopsis before I started and realized, okay, I don't know if this is going to be a rom-com. And I went to the impression then that this was going to be a book about Elizabeth and being a chemist and having to prove herself and ending up pregnant and assuming that Calvin was going to leave her or basically be a deadbeat dad in order to pursue his career and not let her have her own. Boy, was I wrong. I very quickly learned, a third of the way in and big things happen. I was completely wrong.
I also thought there was going to be a deadbeat dad situation. You were so good reading the synopsis before you started this book. I just went in blind and was unsure what to expect. And the very beginning of the book starts off talking about Mad, and then she doesn't come up again in the story for quite a while. So I was a little bit thrown off with that. I suspected there was going to be an accidental pregnancy and an uninvolved father. Had I read the synopsis, maybe I would have been a little more clued in, because it actually says on there that she met and fell in love with Calvin, so I would have known his involvement.
Yeah, I don't typically read the synopsis, but for some reason, this one I did. Now, we did get a little bit of rom-com mixed in with the first, quarter of this book with the romance between Calvin and Elizabeth, and I personally loved this storyline between them. I liked this relationship, even though it was kind of quick and a whirlwind, because that is not the point of this book. But I thought Bonnie did such a great job at defining these characters and really bringing them to life on paper for such a short period that we've got them. And the willingness of Elizabeth to help Calvin after he just vomited all over her from a date. It just was cute, romantic, and I absolutely loved it. And that they were truly equals, and that he never once really pressured her to get married and have kids, because she was very adamant that that is not what she wanted.
I also really liked the love story between the two of them. Elizabeth was in love with her work, right? She was in love with her career, And the reason that she didn't want to get married was because she didn't want her identity to be lost through marriage. And she didn't want all of the credit for her work to go to her husband. And Calvin really respected that. He understood it and was really good for her in a lot of ways. And she was also really good for him. I think they learned a lot from each other.
Who they were before they met each other to who they were after they were together for that period of time were probably two different people completely from what the outside perspective would have been. Unfortunately, poor Calvin meets this terrible, untimely death by getting ran over by a police car, nonetheless, in this book. And that ultimately changes Elizabeth. She was a little selfish, I guess you could say, but not in a bad way, right? In a put her forward kind of way. And I think that Calvin's death really changed her perspective on what companionship is. She goes from being alone to being lonely, because after Calvin dies, she's realized what a gem that was and what a precious time she had, and now it's gone.
I wonder if there was a part of her that regretted not marrying Calvin after he had died. And I think it's telling of the time that this took place, that Evelyn didn't want to marry Calvin because she didn't want to lose her identity, but then she ended up being punished for not being married, because once her workplace found out that she was pregnant, they fired her. Had she been married and was not pregnant out of wedlock, I don't know that that would have happened. So it's like no matter what, she was paying this unnecessary cost.
My headcanon is that even if she was married to Calvin, they disliked her so much because she was competition, they would have found some other way to fire her, unfortunately.
You're probably right about that.
But I'm also just really anti-Hastings Institute in that leadership.
Elizabeth also had a lot of self-reflection after Calvin's death because she blamed herself. Like I mentioned before, that she was a nonconformist. And the one time that she did what she was supposed to do, she got 630 a leash because of this new leash law and made Calvin use it. It resulted in his death. And I think that made her even more determined to pave her own path and not to pay attention to the status quo.
She goes through the book after this death even more determined that she has something to prove, that she can do it all. And I think Calvin's death solidified that for her. She had something to prove before, but now she really has something to prove. Same when Mad comes along, that she wants to prove she can do it all. So were you surprised that she kept the pregnancy after Calvin's death despite never wanting children?
I'm not too surprised by it. I think she had some practice with 630, and I think she also viewed the baby as being a gift from Calvin.
I do think that if it was any other instance, she wouldn't have kept the pregnancy. But I think given the situation, it was her last remaining tie to him, the man that she loved completely, that it makes sense that she did. So I wasn't too surprised there, but I do think it was just the only instance that she would have done this.
I think that's right. Also, I had to do my research here, and I learned that abortion wasn't legal in Great Britain until the late 1960s, and not in the US until the 1970s. Now, of course, abortions were performed illegally during that time, but the author didn't even address it as a consideration at all. And I wondered if perhaps that was just to avoid complicating the story too much. So since Elizabeth did keep the baby and raised it, in what ways do you think motherhood changed Elizabeth?
So I kind of touched on this before with the selfish thing. I think having Mad taught her to open up her circle and that you can still put yourself first when you need to, but you can expand that circle to encompass other people. But in other ways, it was still the same for her, right? She was determined. She knew she wanted to continue her work even as a mother. She puts a lab in her kitchen. She converts the whole thing herself into an industrial grade lab so she can still continue her work for the goal of being published.
You mentioned that determination, and not only was she determined to continue her career, but I think she was determined to be a good mom too. She was also just really hard on herself. Something that stood out to me was a conversation she had with Harriet where she felt like she was a bad mom or she was doing a bad job because she thought about giving Mad away twice. So I think this situation, trying to balance raising a child with continuing on with her career, really gave her a lot of respect and admiration for women who are stay-at-home moms. So she realizes that taking care of children and taking care of a household is a lot of work. Through that, she realizes there's no such thing as the average housewife, which she says multiple times on her show.
So, Supper at 6, which is the show that Elizabeth goes on in order to support her and her daughter while she also continues to do her research, ended up resonating with the women of the era. And I thought it was really great that it inspired others and showed them that there's no such thing as the average housewife and validated the work that these women are doing, because it is work. If anyone has to cook, clean, take care of the entire house, take care of their children by themselves, for the most part, that's a lot of work. And it's amazing that she validates it and resonates with these women. I do wonder, though, if given that time period, because unfortunately there were, and unfortunately even more, there still are some people that believe, including women, that their place is in the home, tending to the children, cleaning, cooking, and that is their entire role and expectation. I do wish there had been a little more female pushback on the show than just the male pushback that we saw in the book, because I do think for that time there would have been some female pushback as well. I love that the validation was there from the female audience, but I think there would have been a small negative female pushback too, and I would have liked to see the civil war almost between those.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. I definitely think there would have been a lot of pushback for a show that progressive in that time period. And I thought the book did a good job of portraying that pushback for the most part. But you're right, it was primarily from men. And I think there would have actually been some women who pushed back as well.
And I think the pushback would have almost come from a place of defensiveness rather than thinking that she was wrong. I think they probably would have pushed back thinking she's demeaning what I'm doing and that I should be doing more than this, but I want to be here. And that is totally fine and totally valid. Everyone should do what they want to do. But I wonder if that would have been the motivation for it.
Yeah, or just being defensive because they're afraid of change. I do appreciate how motivational Elizabeth made the show. In that time period, pretty much all women were expected to cook dinner for their families. And she made it this playful experiment and taught women that cooking dinner is more than just a mindless task.
I also appreciated her tagline at the end of each show saying, "Children, go set the table. Your mother needs a moment to herself," because it helped show boundaries that can be established even for adults against their own children. As a mother of 3, there are boundaries that I even have to set with my own children. I love them to death. They are my pride and joy, and I would do anything for them. There are days where I have to be like, hey, I need a minute. If you are okay, I'm going to go into my room. I'm going to go sit in a massage chair and read because I need some time for myself. In some of those times, I love to watch a good cooking show on YouTube, which makes me wonder if we think that a show like this would do well today.
I think it would. I mean, I like to watch, like MasterChef and some of those other cooking challenge shows. I think a show like this would offer a different perspective on cooking. And while I would appreciate that different perspective, I don't know how interested I would be in the science aspect of it just because I don't know anything about chemistry. I took physics instead and never learned the basics.
Chemistry was the one science I took in high school that I really struggled with. I had to push myself real hard on that one. But I really enjoyed the concept of it. Now, I have to say, there is a show on YouTube, and it's a channel called Epicurious, and they have all sorts of different cooking stuff on there. But there is a particular segment or playlist that they have of a show called Four Levels, or it's sometimes titled Four Levels of Risotto or whatever. And they have three chefs, a level 1, 2, and 3 chef, show how they make this dish, with level 1 being your basic home chef, a level 2 chef being kind of in between, maybe like at a basic restaurant, and your level 3 chef would be your pro chef. And then level 4 is a food expert who actually breaks down the science behind the techniques and what is happening when you're cooking the food. And I think I've watched almost all of those. It has become my guilty pleasure at night to watch cooking shows, including that one. And I just my pro tip, if you are trying to curb any late night snacks, please don't watch cooking shows.
Sometimes I like to watch cooking shows as I'm falling asleep just because, I don't know, it's kind of like ASMR for me. Like, it just puts me right to sleep.
My husband is also the type who loves to experiment with foods, and so we went through a grilled cheese phase. I'm talking grilled cheeses 2 to 3 times a week, getting different kinds of cheeses. You think about your childhood, and grilled cheese was like a simple, cheap, affordable meal. And that was not the case when coming into our grilled cheeses.
Sounds really good, though.
The kids would ask us like for a bite of their grilled cheese, and we'd give it to them, and they'd be like, please don't, that's not a grilled cheese. But I digress. Back to the book. She ultimately has this found family by the end of it. All of these characters were very different from each other, so which one was your favorite?
I think Walter was my favorite supporting character. What about you?
I really liked Reverend Wakely because he was very different from your typical church leader at the time, very progressive, and just a good example. And I really liked the backstory with him and Calvin and their writing, and I just felt emotionally attached to him, even though I probably really had no reason to be.
I liked his character a lot too, but I think the thing I liked most about him was the way that he bonded with Mad and helped her out.
That was actually what I put down for my favorite moment, was the moment where they're bonding together and they are sharing their secrets with each other. And I just thought it was so beautiful, so cute, so sweet. So I guess we're going to jump ahead to that then. What was your favorite moment?
My favorite was when Elizabeth went rowing with Calvin. He was teaching her how to row, and he kept saying, oh, you're doing this wrong, and you're doing this wrong, and you're doing this wrong. And she was just like, hold on a minute. That's too much. What is my biggest issue? What is the one thing I need to focus on? As soon as he gave her that answer, she just figured it out right away, improved her technique, and then rowing became an analogy for life. And I thought that was a really good, big lesson moment.
It was also really cool how then she's like, oh, this is just physics, and applies her real life education and knowledge and then succeeds with it.
Yes, exactly.
As I read this book, I don't know if you have ever watched Bones, the TV show from, I believe it came out in like 2004. I think almost all the DVDs. I've watched it religiously. And each time I watch it, it is cheesier and cheesier each time. But I freaking love the show. And Elizabeth reminds me so much of Emily Deschanel's character, Dr. Brennan, because she is so matter of fact, very factual, almost dry when she talks with other people. And I kept telling my husband multiple times while I was reading, oh my God, it's Bones. The whole time I'm watching this, she's like Bones, but in the 60s.
I haven't watched all of that show, but I've seen a couple episodes and I can see the resemblance.
And especially at the beginning, because Bones, in the beginning, she is even more dry, even more matter of fact, and doesn't necessarily have fluctuations in her personality or able to take a joke. But as the series progresses and she brings these people into her life and has a child and the rest of her family, she just becomes a little bit more relatable as a person, even though she's so well educated and so smart.
I don't know that I had a specific character reference for Elizabeth as I was reading this, but her story and her, struggle to succeed as a female chemist made me think a little bit of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and how she experienced similar things becoming a lawyer.
I think that is a great comparison, and I'm sure there are many others from that time that would be great examples that were like Elizabeth. Now, speaking of powerful women, did you expect the ending with Calvin's mother?
Not at all. That came out of nowhere, in my opinion.
Think?
I do think so, because there were a lot of surprises about Calvin's family and his upbringing throughout the book. First, we learned that his parents died in a car accident. Then we learned those weren't his real parents. He was adopted. Then we learned about the man who showed up at the boys' home, and Calvin was led to believe that was his father and that his mother died during childbirth and his father just couldn't cope, so gave him up for adoption. So in my head at that point, I was like, Calvin's biological mother is dead. Like, it's just this guy. And then later he had this pen pal that he was writing to. I really thought the pen pal was going to be his father. Then we learned that the pen pal all along was Wakely, and Wakely just didn't know how to respond. So then I went back to thinking the guy from the Parker agency was Calvin's biological father. And I did not expect a woman to be in charge of this foundation. I don't know why I didn't expect that. It caught me off guard. Like, not only was there a woman in charge of this, but the woman who's in charge is also Calvin's biological mother. I did not see it coming.
I hadn't even thought to think that the pen pal could be his father. That didn't even once cross my mind, but I like your train of thought.
Yeah, I was like, he's writing to this pen pal, and then he says, oh, I hate my father, I wish my father was dead. And so then the pen pal, who in my head was the father, was like, well, if he wishes I was dead, I'm just not going to respond anymore.
That makes a lot of sense, honestly. I think that actually would have been a great way for the book to go. I wasn't surprised by his mother only because all of the letters he received were talking about getting money from him, but there was a repeated letter by a woman claiming to be his mother that wanted to give him money. And the fact that it was regular and relentless, I figured, okay, this is real. Now, how that was going to play out, being actually in charge of that group, I did think that the man coming to the boys' home was his father, and that maybe there was like an estrangement between his father and his mother, and that was going to come into play, but I was wrong there. But I wasn't too surprised about his mother coming in at the end and wanting to pay for something. Now, I have to say, this is another reason why I took a little bit off of my stars for this book, was because at the end we have this great situation where Elizabeth is now going to be in charge of her department and all of this and allowing her to do her work, which I think is great, and I think that is wonderful. One, I hope she has an amazing support staff that's going to allow her to do work, because administration is a full-time job and it's going to be a lot of paperwork. Two, I wished that we had seen more of her side work happening while she was doing Supper at 6 and making a discovery or writing her paper and getting it published. before the end of the book. And I think, and I have not finished the show, so I could be wrong, but I think that is where they are going to go with the TV show. I could be wrong. I could absolutely be saying this with full confidence, and then somebody's going to laugh and say, no, that's not how the show went. But like I said, I still have a few episodes left.
I agree. I'd like to see more of that. So I hope that is the direction the show is going.
So I think for our last discussion question, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about real life applications of this book and the lessons associated with it. You know, we're very fortunate that the role that we have as women today is very different and better than women in the 60s, but that doesn't mean that we don't experience strife or setbacks. So do you have any real life examples of ways that you've been discounted because you're a woman?
I've been fortunate in working for companies that normally have a pay scale that is the same for women and men. So fortunately, I haven't been subject to a pay gap. But I think for me, the best example of this is being sexually harassed and sexually assaulted by male coworkers, and then it just kind of being swept under the rug and my complaints not being taken seriously. I think any woman who says no to that question and says she hasn't been discounted because she's a woman just isn't thinking hard enough.
Very, very much so. Even if it's a little less abrasive or a little more subtle than what you might think. I feel like almost every woman has experienced this in some capacity. For me, I've had several things. One that sticks out for me is when I was pregnant with my oldest, we moved away from the town we were living in, closer to our hometown, because of the wonderful family support that we had and wanting to watch our children. So we made that move, and my husband had a great job lined out for him that he was offered. Then I was searching for a job full-time, and I was just out of college, and I had a potential job lined up. I went in for the interview. It went pretty well. The first red flag should have been that the person I met with after the interview then said, here's all the things you did wrong in your interview, but we still like you. That should have been my red flag. But, you know, I was desperate. When you're growing a human and you need income, you do what you got to do. And so I was like, okay, that's weird. But she had told me, I think that you'll be a good fit here. I want to do a personality test to find out which team we want to assign you to, and then we'll get you a start date. Great. So I left there, and she said, give me an email and let me know your availability. Left that and went to my email almost immediately and said, it was great meeting with you. I really appreciate the interview. Here's my dates for availability. Now that we're at this point and we're looking at a start date, I want to let you know that I am pregnant and I will be due in March, and then I'll take, 6 weeks off and I'll be back at work. And, oh, look, 1, I got ghosted. 2, then the position magically was unavailable and they were no longer filling it. So that was a fun time. And then I've just had issues medically being taken seriously about different pain things. I've had back problems. I've had a weird stomach situation for a couple years, that getting a doctor to take me seriously, that this isn't just a stomach ache, or, oh, it's not just a little bit of a backache. Unfortunately, I have a female doctor who is phenomenal and always takes me seriously, but I always try to go to her. But if I ever have to get into somebody else that is not her, I don't always have the best experience.
Yeah, there's a big push in female medicine right now in women's health care, and I hope some improvements are made there, because that's a struggle for a lot of women, especially when you look into like endometriosis and PCOS and a number of hormonal issues. It just literally takes women years to get a proper diagnosis for those things, and it shouldn't be like that.
Nope, it shouldn't, and yet here we are.
Well, sorry to leave you on such a bleak note, but that is all we have for our discussion today. Thank you so much for joining us. We'd love to hear your thoughts on lessons in chemistry. If you would like to connect with us, please consider following us on TikTok or Instagram. We are at Influence Book Podcast on both platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate us wherever you get your podcasts.
We look forward to our next episode when we will be discussing Verity by Colleen Hoover. Until next time, happy reading!